So, not for the first time, England is in a big conversation with regard to the flag, the English flag, the St. George's Cross. And I want to talk a little bit about this as someone who's lived 99% of my life in this country. And I wanted to just share some thoughts. So, there seems to be some kind of movement or some kind of campaign to get as many English flags and even the Union flag up in various places around the country. And so we're seeing England. So just for a bit of context, usually, of course, we don't really see any displays of flags really outside of like the World Cup or European Championships or maybe things like VE Day and the coronation. There was a bunch of flaggage going on during that time. But outside of those times, English people at least aren't particularly, it's not something that happens here, is it? Flags being put up necessarily. So it's kind of unusual. I've seen a few where I live as well in the town centre. And this has got, people concerned, and we've of course descended into the usual culture war, that's going on. So on the one hand, the people who are putting up these flags, or the germ of this idea to start getting these flags everywhere, seems to have come from someone in Birmingham, some outskirts of Birmingham, where I think a council took down some flags that were up in order to put up CCTV cameras. I mean, gosh, if that, that's a little microcosm of today's England, isn't it? Gosh. But anyway, in response to that, some campaign group kind of got together and started to encourage people to put flags up wherever they could. And the idea is it's all about national pride and English culture and English values and all that sort of stuff, And then on the other side, of course, there is a lot of concern because if this was happening in 1998 or something, people wouldn't bat an eyelid. Maybe even 2008, people wouldn't bat an eyelid. But this is happening in 2025. Where right now, as we speak, there is these protests happening out, against immigration and immigrants and so forth. Just last year, we had the whole riots that sparked in this country, anti-immigration riots, anti-immigrant riots, which had a large component of racism in there, xenophobia. And so there's a concern that people are using this, it's all about national pride, as a cover for, furthering the interest and furthering the message of basically xenophobia and racism. And, that's what the concerns are. And of course, let me start there. So, I grew up in this country, and I remember when I was a lad in the 80s, when if you saw the Union Jack, the Union flag, the red, white and blue one, if you saw that flag, immediately you were on tenterhooks, unless it was actually, at Buckingham Palace or something. If you saw that flag, if you saw someone waving a Union flag in those days, you were immediately right, watch out. Because in them days, the National Front were the only people, and English football hooligans were the only people using those flags. The only time you saw people brandishing those flags, people were probably doing swastika salutes and, beating up non-white people. Or doing monkey chants in football stadiums and going on these NF rallies or BNP rallies. That's the only time you ever saw that Union flag. So, but then the English flag, a bit less so. The St. George Cross was a bit less associated with those types. And it was a bit more associated, I think, with football. So, if you go on YouTube and just put in Arsenal v Liverpool 1984 or something, and you'll see that they'll always put the fans would always have England flags there with like the name of their towns written on them. To this day, this still happens. So it was still kind of associated with football, which in them days meant being associated with football hooliganism and the racism and whatnot, but not quite so directly. But something distinctly changed. I remember it very, very, very clearly. I was at uni in these days, and it was Euro 96, which was held in this country, held in England. And Euro 96, it kind of started a little bit in Italia 90. The first time England were any good at football for a long time, and they got to the World Cup semi-finals. That was the first time I was like, a little bit of reason to be prideful for people in this country, in England, about England. You know, symbols are very, very important. You know, don't let people fool you. Symbols are extremely important. And certainly come 1996, there was this outflow. It started off a bit dodgy for England, but suddenly England again became good. They battered Holland 4-1. I remember it very, very clearly. Boiling hot sunny day. And Three Lions, the song, was the first original version of that song was released. It's Coming Home. And it was just like this euphoric kind of era. It was also the Britpop era. Oasis, Blur, some of these other groups were ruling the roost. And Tony Blair was coming up, New Labour. It was like a period of national renewal in England, at least. And the England flags were big, whereas before the Union flag was probably the more common flag to be waved by England fans. From 1996 now, the English flag became back to the fore again, and you'd see it everywhere. And whereas before it would be a reaction of, okay, some fascists are nearby. It was suddenly like oh no, this is a flag that represents the people of this country, the regular, normal people of this country. And so it was quite, like I said, it was a euphoric moment and a euphoric period. And it almost felt like the English flag had been like wrestled back from control from these far-right bigots. So over the last 20 years or so, of course, there's been ebbs and flow in this. So the English Defence League from the 2010s, they reappropriated that flag. And so we've gone kind of back to the far right being associated with that England flag. And yeah, here we are. So I certainly see the concern that people will have about this, and unfortunately we're just in that time we're in a political and cultural time here in the UK and in England in particular, where there's a sense of foreboding. We've seen a little snippet of it last summer with those riots, and there's a sense of foreboding about what could be behind this and what it could be, what it could lead to, basically. So I get that. But it's an interesting question, though, isn't it? Because I go to, whenever I go abroad, I go to we went to Spain. You go to Spain on holiday and you'll see the Spanish flag flying around most places. And you go to I went to Latin America years and years ago, and you would see the Argentina flag, the Peru flag, the Bolivia flag just flying around. There's something interesting about, obviously I don't know the inner workings of politics in those countries, but it does seem that here in England, at least, that their English people have almost, like I said, the symbols of Englishness have been taken over by some of these extremists. And I think there's a conversation to be had there. I think there's some work to be done here by the not fascist people in Britain, by the not extremist people in Britain and England in particular, to think about, well, have they demonized the symbols of England too much? I think they have. I think that, one of the reasons why some people get drawn into these EDLs and reforms and all this kind of stuff, one of the reasons they get drawn into that sort of stuff is because they don't really have an outlet for expressing like a healthy nationalism, if you want to say. It's like to express any kind of pride in England or Englishness and whatnot, you'll get, maybe it feels like you'll just get shouted down and called a bigot and a racist and this sort of stuff. And I don't know how this gets solved, to be honest. But it's an interesting conundrum. If people are waving the Palestinian flag, there'd be no furore because people associate the Palestinian flag with a certain set of political and geopolitical human rights concerns, I don't know. Is it possible? Is it possible for that England flag, that St. George's Cross, to just be defanged and depoliticized, desectarianized, and made to be a representation of the good that this country can represent? Because this is one more thing that, I'm very political. I'm extremely proud of my African heritage. And you look at my videos are all about mainly discussing black issues that pertain to black people in this country. I'm very deeply into, trying to understand our situation in this world as black people, African people, and so forth. Yeah. But I'm also an English person. I live in England. I've basically lived all my life in England. Both my children were born in this country. All they know is England. I've rarely, if ever, experienced any overt racism in this country. My experience in this country has been overwhelmingly positive, actually. And the people in this country, I think, overall, the people in this country have a good heart, just like people in any other country. It's just that the stupid politicians and some of these demagogues and extremists just whip up certain people on the edges of English society to give this country a bad name in some regards. But I don't know. I'm waffling a little bit now, but I think it's an interesting question that needs to be had. I think, actually, let me end on this. I think that Britain, England in particular, what the left in particular needs to do here is to sing a lot more, make a lot more noise about the mass movements in this country that have happened over centuries, not even just decades, not even just going back to the start of the Labour movement in the 19th century. I'm talking centuries, the Wat Tylers and, the peasants' revolts and all this sort of stuff. You know what I mean? I think the left in particular needs to stop being so obsessed with talking about, niche identity politics issues which affect tiny little slivers of the English society. It's good, of course, to want to stand in solidarity with those groups that are marginalized and so forth. Of course, a lot of good things came about as a result of the left in this country standing in solidarity with black people, for example. It was the left, the likes of Jeremy Corbyn and others, who were there alongside some of our elders as they were fighting for, fighting against the racism and the white supremacy and the anti-blackness. But that shouldn't be at the expense of the overwhelming majority of people in this country, And I think that's the key. That's the key, is to repopularize and publicize the great and deep history of radical mass movements in England, reinterpreting and telling a story about things like the World War II, World War I, even empire and stuff like that, in a way that brings out the class element, the fact that different interests, different societal interests are at play in England. And yes, you had the British Empire, but that British Empire wasn't for the benefit of the masses of English people, British people. It was for the benefit of the few. And the masses had to do all the fighting and the killing and the this, that and the other. Yes, of course, they got some benefits from it. But I think that's the kind of route, that's the kind of direction that needs to be taken here in this country. For too long, Englishness and Britishness in this country has just been dominated by reactionaries. And somehow the left in this country in particular, and just regular community people in this country, need to, make more of an effort to kind of, instill some element of pride and confidence in English people. There's a lot of negativity and a lot of denigrating and putting down of England and Britain at the moment. Oh, England is finished. It's a terrible country. Leaving England, leaving Britain. And oddly, as someone who, as a black person, all the areas that black people, say Hackney, for example, the first place we lived in this country was Hackney, and Hackney's reputation was awful. Oh, Hackney, ghetto, ghetto. Same with Brixton, ghetto, ghetto. All this talking down. Meanwhile, the smart people were buying out properties in Hackney and buying out properties in Brixton because it was only going to be a matter of time before the narrative would shift and suddenly Hackney is where everyone wants to live. And I think a similar thing could be happening with England at the moment. The negativity about England and Britain is just it's cartoonishly negative. It's too negative. Farage and all that sort of stuff. It's just it's way off the mark. England and Britain is not that bad. Yeah, there's problems here, but it's not that bad. And so, maybe there needs to be some sort of like cultural renaissance where, people wrest control. Anyway, I'm rambling, but there you go. That's just my thoughts on the whole flag situation. I'll be interested to hear what you think about all of this. My name is Eli Wananda, and I have many other videos on this channel that you'd find interesting. There's one here, for example, which YouTube will recommend, and there's one here which I think follows on nicely from the topic of the video. All right, take care of yourselves, and I will speak to you soon. Peace.